for me, a lot of people see racism, around the whole issue of, biases, implicit biases. And if we can just address, the implicit biases that people have, then we're there,
right.
But
Right.
the reality is that it's not about the biases. It's about really addressing the economic barriers to progress, and it's about advocating for economic dignity. So, most people, it's the one bad apple kind of thing. We just change, a few people and make sure that, their mindset is right. Then we've handled racism, but it's embedded in the system that's causing these racialized outcomes, and a lot of it is tied to economics.
Well, and
out of our history, and so we have to address that. We got a daddy called it the redistribution of wealth.
That's where I was going with that. And
the redistribution of wealth.
Right. And you can't redistribute stuff that you never got. And if you were emancipated, however we're defining that, and you didn't get the 40 acres and a mule, how do you start? And then the sharecropping, and then Jim Crow. And I don't necessarily, maybe you can assist me when we talk about, because people would somehow read that and say, well, why are we keep living in the past? Slavery is over, and I didn't own a slave, and you weren't a slave. And I'm sort of wondering, though, how do we get people, especially in the context of the resistance to critical race theory, which is about acknowledging that history? So how do you resolve this? And I did tune into your session last week on critical race theory. What are people missing in that conversation relative to having to understand the past in order to sort of understand economics and to understand the disparities that persist? That's a big, giant question. So you can just pull any of that out you want to chat about.
Yeah, it is a big, giant question. Well, first of all, it's a misnomer. Let's get that straight.
Let's get that straight. That's my air quotes there.
That's misinformation. It's a smokescreen. The backlash through the legislation that is being passed now across this country.
Yes,
is a result of the wokeness on last year.
Now you're doing your air quotes. I got you.
And the action of some people to really look at how do we address, because we never, that I know of, maybe you can enlighten me on this, but I've never seen such massive concentration around the notion of equity. Maybe equality, but not equity.
Not equity,
maybe
right?
Diversity, inclusion, but not equity. But equity just has become this, I don't even think it's a buzzword. I think people are really wrestling with it. They're really pulling back, the curtain and looking at, how things are sorting out in their different environments. And so for me, I've been wrestling with what do we do with all this now? How do we make sure that the next generation can connect the dots between what happened then, not just the next generation, but even the adults, what happened then and what's happening now, and how it's showing up. And I think when people are presented with the data, and all the emotion is taken out of it, more and more people awaken to the truth and the reality that we have, these inequities. But then the question becomes, what I hear a lot out of some of my white friends and associates is, how do we begin the process, of making things more fair? How do we redeem the past? And I said something the other day when there was when the Justice Department started talking about the payment to the folks at the border, separated from each other. And while I, understand it and agree something should be done, my concern is what happened to all of that happened with the Black community. It just seems like over and over again, we're overlooking the Black community that, labored in this country free and was abused to do it. It's not like we volunteered labor.
Well, and let's throw in some indigenous folks in there also.
Indigenous, right, exactly.
Whose land was stolen, yes.
Yeah.
As we talk about land acknowledgements, there seems to be a whole sort of, however we define reparations in that sense.
Right. So for me, how you get people to see it, I just think you got to lay out the data.
Right.
Because a lot of people, they live in silos.
Right.
They don't hear this information.
Right.
They assume because we're showing up in places and we look a certain way, we have access to certain things that economically, everything is well.
Right.
And it's not true. I mean, like here in Atlanta, we have the worst racial wealth gap. Most people wouldn't think Atlanta is supposed to be the home of civil and human rights would have the worst racial wealth gap.
Right.
And people living here in the white community have not been aware of that. And as a part of our Leadership Atlanta crew, I just came out of the class 2 years ago, they expose you to all of this. But then nobody is addressing it.
Right. Is your center doing any of that work relative to the initiatives specifically that you have? Because I know you do trainings in nonviolence, but is your center taking those on as a task as well? I mean, I know